Kia ora, this is Liz. Welcome to Dames Ablaze. If you're new to the channel, can I suggest you go watch the intro video so you know what's going on. If you're not new to the channel, you do know what's going on. So you grab your Bibles, and while you're grabbing your Bibles, I will remind you to hit like, subscribe, share. I can never remember what it all is. Anyway, today we're looking at John chapter 7, verses 1 to 5. We have finally entered a new chapter. Awesome. So I'll read them to you now. Says, John chapter 7, 1 to 5 says, After these things Jesus walked in Galilee, for he did not want to walk in Judea because the Jews sought to kill him. Now the Jews' feast of tabernacles was at hand. His brothers therefore said to him, Depart from here and go into Judea, that your disciples also may see the works that you are doing. For no one does anything in secret, while he himself seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. For even his brothers did not believe in him. So Jesus now leaves Judea, which is in the southern kingdom of Israel, and goes to hang out in Galilee, which is almost dead center of the northern kingdom. I will now give you a potted history lesson so you can get some of the background noise that made up Israel's story. The country was split in two when Rehoboam, who is Solomon's son, took the reins after his death. He, very unwisely, listened to his friends instead of his father's advisers and treated the people's request for leniency with disdain, claiming he would be harsher even than his father had been. He managed to offend most of the tribes, and so 10 of them basically took off and formed their new nation, which they called Israel, under the rule of Jeroboam, who was a descendant of Joseph's. The whole land was unified again after the Babylonian captivity of the southern kingdom, but it was a very slow process, and Israel was always vulnerable to stronger nations, hence the vassalage to Rome in Jesus' time. History lesson complete. So Jesus is now staying in what was once the northern kingdom, amongst the 10 seceded tribes, although whether their blood is still there is kind of debatable. They were taken off by Assyria and never returned en masse, though it's entirely possible, even likely really, that individuals or family groups did in fact return. Anywho, Jesus is now in Galilee because the Jews, so that's the hierarchy, not the entirety of the Jewish nation, those Jews wanted to kill him. Eventually, of course, he will let them, but that time is not yet. So when the Feast of Tabernacles comes around, Jesus is not in Jerusalem. So Tabernacles is one of the 3 feasts that was meant to be celebrated at Jerusalem. So this was a dictation, command way back in Moses' day. So this is out of Deuteronomy. 3 times a year, all your males shall appear before the Lord your God in the place which he chooses. So he chooses Jerusalem. That would be the Feast of Leavened Bread, so unleavened bread rather, that's Passover, the Feast of Weeks, which is Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. So remember now that the feeding of the 5,000 took place near the time of Passover. There is no indication that Jesus went to Jerusalem to celebrate it. When it did arrive, he seems to be busy in the synagogue at Capernaum. So it looks like his brothers had expected to catch up with him during that festival, and he wasn't there, so they kind of come looking for him. That's what it looks like, but we don't really know. The phrase after these things, which is what chapter 7 started with, after these things, cannot be referring to the conversation at Capernaum that chapter 6 covered, right? Passover was a spring festival. That was either March or April, as far as our calendar goes. Tabernacle falls in either September or October of our calendar, so that means there's been 6 months since the Bread of Heaven bombshell, and over 6 months since he's been in Jerusalem proper. However, that doesn't mean he's been idle, right? It's believed that the missing months are described in Matthew's Gospel between the chapters 14 and 18 of Matthew. If this is right, it's during that time that he heads up to Tyre and Sidon and heals the Syrophoenician woman's daughter. He heals lots of people around the Sea of Galilee, feeds another mass group. That time it's 4,000. goes into Caesarea Philippi, is transfigured on the mountain, and comes down and heals the young boy that was being thrown into the fire by a demon, plus doing an awful lot of teaching on various topics. So it's a very busy 6 months, and Tabernacles is now drawing near. So Tabernacles is also called the Feast of Booths. It was a 7-day feast in which the Israelites were to make temporary shelters called booths. They were made out of the branches of palm trees, the boughs of leafy trees, and willows from the brooks, and they were to live in those temporary dwellings for 7 days. So the first day of that whole week is called a high holy one. That means there's no common work to be done on that day, apart from the gathering of the tree branches and the making of the booths. And the 8th day of that week was also a high holy day. In between those 2 high holy days, they were to give offerings each and every day. So the idea of the booths was to remind them of their wilderness wandering years, and it was, I think it was meant to keep them humble as they remembered why they wandered around in the wilderness for 40 years, when the trip from Egypt to the Promised Land realistically, even in those days, should have taken between 11 and 12 days. 40 years seems quite an extensive grouping. And if you don't know why they had to do that, you need to reread the book of Deuteronomy, I think, or Numbers. Anyway, this feast, the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Tabernacles, is now drawing near. So Jesus gets a visit from his brothers. So the word brother there is adelphos, and it means brother, which means someone born into the same family as you, although it can also mean a member of the same religious community. John uses this word 14 times in his gospel. 3 times he is referring to Simon as Andrew's brother. 5 times it has to do with Lazarus being the brother of Mary and Martha. 2 times he uses it, he's referring to the followers of Jesus. And the other 4 are connected with Jesus himself. So which does John mean here? Are we talking literal brothers or just believers? Well, it can't be believers, because you're told in verse 5, they don't believe. Which leaves us with the simple thought that these are his actual brothers. Now, there are some who say that this word can mean cousin, but I couldn't find anything to back that assertion up. The reason for calling them cousins is based on the supposition that the one called James, so i.e. Jesus' brother, who was also called James, that one is the Apostle James, the son of Alphaeus. Alphaeus is said by those who hold this view to be a brother of Joseph, Jesus' father. This is highly problematic, however, as James, the son of Alphaeus, is a member of the 12, and therefore one of the believers. It's difficult to explain how he can be in both the group of Jesus's unbelieving brothers and also in the group of 12 believing disciples. Also in the book of Acts, we're given a list of the disciples who are in the upper room on the day of Pentecost. James, the son of Alphaeus, is mentioned, as are Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers. Seems unlikely that James, the son of Alphaeus, would be mentioned as separate to the brothers of Jesus if they're all referring to cousins of Jesus. It's a theory that's highly speculative, and the Bible does not give any hints to this kind of relationship existing, so it seems odd. Well, you have to ask, why would it be silent on such a relationship when it manages to tell us about all the other relationships that are relevant? Surely this one would be pretty relevant. As far as I and many scholars are concerned, these are his actual brothers, born of both Joseph and Mary. Though the Bible does not strictly tell us that they had intercourse, it is strongly implied in the book of Matthew, where it says, "Then Joseph, being aroused from sleep, did as the angel of the Lord commanded him, and took to him his wife, and did not know her." Okay, that can't mean just know as in know who she was. That doesn't make any sense. The word know here is being used for intercourse. He did not know her till she had brought forth her firstborn son. So the word till in that sentence means that there was a barrier or limit that was set on Joseph, and it lasted up until Jesus was born, and then it was no more. Jesus had 4 brothers and at least 2 sisters, based on the Nazarene statement that his sisters, not sister, sisters, were with them. So they are all younger than him, of course, and they were full blood brothers. That's why they're hanging out with his mother. The fact that his father is never mentioned most likely means that he is in fact dead at this point, and it also explains why his mother is hanging out with his brothers. She's not with them on this particular occasion, but sometime in the past 6 months, they did all go to Jesus and tried to talk to him over the crowds. So we're just going to flick back into Matthew 12 to remind ourselves of what went on there. I'm going to read from verse 46 to verse 50. While he was still talking to the multitudes, behold, his mother and brothers stood outside, seeking to speak with him. Then one said to him, Look, your mother and your brothers are standing outside, seeking to speak with you. But he answered and said to the one who told him, Who is my mother, and who are my brothers? And he stretched out his hand towards his disciples and said, Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. So this is why the word brothers eventually became synonymous with Christian. It also again negates the cousin bit, because if it's cousins, it kind of makes the whole thing very clunky and odd and very unworkable. So let's head back to the book of John. His brothers then come and say, Depart from here and go into Judea. Now, why would they do that? What is it that they are looking for or seeking? Are they being rude or encouraging? How can we know which way to take their words? They're at the very least being presumptuous. He is the older brother after all, and they're showing very little respect by speaking to him like this. But we'll let that slide, because he lets that slide. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say they come puzzling rather than with an attitude, because we don't know, do we? They say he should go into Judea, by which they mean Jerusalem, so that his disciples could see him. Now, they're not talking about the 12, of course, because the 12 are with him. But there were plenty of other followers around and about, and believers of Jesus scattered across the whole of Israel, plus a few in Tyre and Sidon, and even probably Caesarea Philippi by this point, right? Perhaps his brothers mean well. They've heard or seen the greater body of believers have dropped away, which they did after that speech at Capernaum, right? Maybe they are worried that the movement is losing traction, and they want to encourage Jesus with this trip into the lion's den. Maybe they don't know it'd be a trip into the lion's den. Or maybe, as many suppose, they're just jealous and aggravated by their brother's weird ideas of who he is. They don't, at this stage at least, believe that he's anything special, which means they haven't really grown up with him doing anything special. I don't know, nobody knows how much they've been hanging around with him in the last few years, so we don't know if they've been witnesses to anything other than the crowds gathering. Now that the crowds have thinned, perhaps they're just trying to be helpful. And who knows, right? It could go either way. But there is a bit in Psalm 69 that might indicate which way it falls. It says this, Because for your sake I have borne reproach, shame has covered my face. I have become a stranger to my brothers and an alien to my mother's children, because zeal for your house has eaten me up. Psalm 69 was written by David, and it's a lament about the state of his life at the time, but there are inklings of Jesus' suffering in there. And that last bit about the zeal of your house is quoted by John back in chapter 2 as being remembered by the disciples after he cleansed the temple at the very start of his ministry. And he has, let's face it, become a bit of an oddity to his family. His brothers, at the very least, are very confused by his attitude. Their suggestion that he should go to Jerusalem for the feast and show himself there. As they say, because as they say, no one does anything in secret, while he himself seeks to be known openly, which has the feel of a proverb, but it's not a biblical one. It was used by the rabbis to describe someone who does not seek to be illustrious. So his brothers see a contradiction between his words and his behavior. They see him hanging out in the backwaters of Israel and wonder how he can be seeking to be known as the Messiah. Makes sense, right? I mean, if you were trying to run for Prime Minister, you wouldn't hide in the middle of the bush, would you? But is that what Jesus is trying to do? Does he want to be known openly? It seems like they're on slightly different wavelengths. Jesus does want people to come to know him, but not so they can elect him as the Messianic king. He's been steadfastly avoiding that possibility throughout his ministry years. Whenever he senses in his spirit that the people are going to try and make him king, he retires to somewhere even more obscure. He did it just before the trip to Capernaum that we spent such a long time studying. By his very actions, he's showing that man's ideas of openness and fame is just not what he's seeking. So to seek for something is to look for it diligently. Jesus had no need, really, to seek diligently, to be heard or seen. Whenever he walked into a town, he became fairly popular quite quickly. The healing ability had something to do with that, of course. You come with something that people are desperate for, you're not going to need an entourage of advertising jingles and slogans, right? The word openly means freedom of speech, oddly, which is kind of ironic given the state of the world. It can also mean boldness or confidence. I don't know that his brothers needed to tell him this. He's been pretty bold in my opinion. He certainly has not held back anything when he's been talking to the Pharisees. So what is it really that they're asking then? If you do these things, show yourself to the world. I wonder what they meant by these things. What rumours do you think that his brothers have heard? I'm morally sure that all the stories of Jesus' work have been going around all the towns of Israel. And I'm sure his mother and his brothers have heard them, right? Now they want to see them. To show them. To show something is to make the invisible visible. To make something known. To manifest it. John tells you that they ask or tell him this because they do not believe. So that would seem to indicate that they want proof of who he claims to be. They want proof that he is the Messiah. They want a sign. And I get that. I mean, if my brother stood up and declared himself to be the President of the United States, I would want a sign. But you got to wonder, right? What exactly are his brothers, what sort of sign, really, are they looking for? When John the Baptizer questions Jesus from prison, right, when he says, are you the one to come or should we still wait? Right, do you remember what his reply was, what Jesus sent back? He said, the blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor are hearing the gospel preached. So these signs followed Jesus wherever he went. That's why he didn't need to advertise, right? These were the markers of the Messiah. And there's no real disputing them. So what is it that his brothers want? So they want him to present himself before the leaders of Israel, so before the Sanhedrin, and let them judge him and declare whether or not he's actually the Messiah, because that's how it's meant to go down. Would that be a wise move at this point? No. Jesus will answer his brothers the same way he answered his mother at the wedding in Cana. He says, my time has not yet come. But we will get into that next week. Let's consider the unbelief of his brothers as we close today. Now, there are some stories that have been running around for years about things that Jesus did as a child. But this unbelief would seem to negate that, right? I don't think Jesus did anything remarkable in his early years. Luke even tells you what he did. He said he increased in wisdom and stature. That's what we get. That's it. That means he built a good reputation with God and with man. And that's it. That's all we get. And it's not much to go on. But that, I think, is the point. There's not much to go on because there just wasn't that much to go on. There was nothing remarkable about him until he met up with John the Baptizer at the Jordan River. His brothers didn't believe because they had no evidence that he was anything other than their big brother. They may have heard the stories going around, but perhaps they actually haven't been around when he's done anything. Each time we see them interacting with Jesus, he's just teaching. So maybe it's fair that they don't believe. Thankfully, they don't stay in this unbelieving state. They eventually come round to his way of thinking. I alluded to it earlier, but in the upper room, waiting for a move of the Spirit after Jesus' ascension, is a large body of people, and we get their names. So this is from Acts 1, 13 to 14. So the names are Peter, James, John and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas the son of James. These all continued with one accord in prayer and supplication with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers. Though they didn't believe him in the beginning of the ministry, or even here in the middle of the ministry, I think his resurrection sealed the deal for them. Well, it would, wouldn't it? Of course it would. Shame it took them that long to believe, but I guess that's the problem with familiarity, right? It takes longer to change the opinions of your family members than it does to convince friends that you've become someone else. Our families draw pictures of us in their minds just as we do of them. Jesus' brothers had a picture of him. He did have a good reputation with man and God, and so they had a good picture of him. It wasn't a mean picture of him, right? They knew him to be kind and considerate of others, but the Messiah? Yeah, nah. Can't have been easy for Jesus to have his family think he was crazy, or worse. He knew, of course, that they would get it eventually, but that period of time when they really thought he'd flipped out, well, it can't have been easy. They didn't believe in him. Judas was sitting there pretending piety whilst all the time plotting. People came and went when they'd had their fill. Even Peter, for all his fine words and statements of belief, would desert him, and he knew that would happen, and yet he continued. Jesus was a strong, determined man, don't you think? He didn't let the opinion of others deter him from his mission. His eyes were constantly on that final prize. I wonder if that's what often makes the rest of us weak. Is it that we don't have the final prize in mind, that our hearts aren't set, as his was, on that final vision? We need to set our minds and keep them set on the things above. The vision of that glorious future is what draws us through those hard days of our presence. As the writer of Hebrews says, let us throw off every encumbrance and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with endurance the race set out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. What gave Jesus strength was the future. So when you're having a bad day, as we all do from time to time, remember that future. Get your eye upon it and let it draw you through the trouble of today into the joy of tomorrow. And that is all I have for you this week. I pray blessings upon you and your household and your endeavours, and pray I see you again healthy and whole again next week. Ka kite anō.